Chapter 15 of That Mainwaring Affair. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. That Mainwaring Affair by A. Maynard Barber. Chapter 15. Mutual Surprises. The Mainwaring party was among the latest arrivals at the pier on the following day, owing to the dilatoriness of Mr. Thornton, Mrs. Mainwaring's efforts to the contrary notwithstanding. At the last moment he appeared, serenely and smilingly unconscious of that lady's frowns of displeasure, to the infinite amusement of his daughter, who whispered to Miss Carleton, "Poor papa! See how auntie glares at him, and he does not even know it." But even Mrs. Mainwaring's facial muscles relaxed slightly at the sight of the beautiful ocean greyhound lying in the harbor, her flags waving and streamers fluttering in the breeze, awaiting only the captain's orders to start her on her homeward course. The decks were crowded with humanity, for the most part laughing and chatting gaily, and singing bits of song, though here and there were sad, tear-stained faces, where long farewells, some of them perhaps the last farewells, were being spoken. "Thank heaven there'll be no tears shed on this occasion," said Isabel Mainwaring, "unless," she added, with a glance of scorn towards Miss Carleton's escort, "Mr. Whitney should contribute a few. I detest such vulgar demonstrations in public." The attorney certainly did not look very cheerful, and even Miss Carleton's sunny face was somewhat overcast, though why it would seem difficult to determine, since she seemed to have no regrets at leaving America. "Mercy me!" ejaculated Mrs. Mainwaring. "What a dreadful crowd! It is far worse than when we came over. Hugh, I wonder if your father examined the ship's list. I particularly requested him to do so. I wish to ascertain whether there would be any friends of ours on board. One does not care to make acquaintances promiscuously, you know." "I don't think the governor investigated the subject very thoroughly," young Mainwaring replied, with a laugh. "I noticed when we registered there were 3 or 4 pages of names preceding ours, and I don't think he gave the matter much attention. If I had time I would look it up for you, Mother, but we must go ashore in a few moments." "If I'm not mistaken, my dear lady," said Mr. Thornton, who had overheard the conversation, "you will have little time or inclination for looking up acquaintances on this trip." "May I ask why?" Mrs. Mainwaring demanded. "I think," he replied maliciously, "that you and Isabel will be too much occupied in cultivating the acquaintance of mal de mer to care for your best friends." "How's that, Thornton? Think it will be rough?" inquired Ralph Mainwaring. "The captain tells me the wind is freshening every moment, and we'll have a decidedly choppy sea before night. I'm thinking we'll have a nasty trip." "In that case, perhaps mamma and I will not be the only victims," said Isabel Mainwaring. "I fear not," responded Mr. Thornton. "Were it not for my inherent chivalry, I should turn back. But I cannot leave you ladies to meet your fate alone." Amid the general confusion of leave-taking, Mr. Whitney turned towards Miss Carleton, saying in a low tone as he took her hand, "I have received cordial invitations both from yourself and Mr. Thornton to visit your home, and I feel assured of a welcome should I accept your courtesy. But pardon me, Miss Carleton, if, after so brief an acquaintance as ours, I inquire whether I might ever hope for a welcome from you other than that of a friend?" The beautiful brown eyes met his own frankly, but all the laughter and sunshine had gone out of them. They were serious and had almost a look of pain. "I am sorry, Mr. Whitney," she said simply, "but it would be very unjust if I led you to hope that I could ever regard you other than as an esteemed friend." "Pardon me for troubling you," he said gently. "Believe me always your friend, and forget that I ever asked for more than friendship." And releasing her hand, he passed on to the others. The final adieus were spoken. Ralph Mainwaring and his son, accompanied by the attorney, went ashore, and Miss Carleton, not caring just then to meet the curious glances of her companions, walked slowly towards the forward part of the deck. She had gone but a few steps, however, when she caught sight of the familiar figure of Mr. Merrick at a little distance, in conversation with a tall, slender man with dark, piercing eyes. He was speaking rapidly in low tones, but his usual non-committal face wore an expression of unmistakable satisfaction. Suddenly he turned and walked swiftly in Miss Carleton's direction. Their eyes met, and in response to her glance of recognition, he quickly crossed to where she was standing. "I have but a few seconds left, Miss Carleton," he said, a genial smile lighting up his face, "but I am glad of an opportunity to wish you a pleasant trip. Are you a good sailor?" "I hardly know," she answered. "I have had so little experience on the sea. Why? Shall we have a stormy passage, do you think?" "Nothing dangerous. A little rough, perhaps, but with congenial company, such as I trust you will find," and his eyes gleamed with kindly merriment, "you will hardly mind that. Good bye, Miss Carleton. Bon voyage. And if I ever in any way can serve you as a friend, do not fail to command me." And before she could reply, he had vanished in the crowd. She looked in vain for any trace of him, then turning to glance at his companion of a moment before, discovered that he had disappeared also. A moment later the great ocean liner glided majestically out of the harbor amid prolonged cheers and a final flutter of farewells, but she was well out upon the tossing waves ere Miss Carleton turned from watching the receding shore to join her friends, as yet having found no solution of the problem perplexing her, nor even the meaning which she felt must be concealed in the words of the detective. They had not been out many hours before it became evident that Mr. Thornton's unfavorable predictions regarding their journey were likely to be fulfilled. The sea was decidedly choppy, and the motion of the boat anything but exhilarating. When the hour for dinner arrived, Mr. Thornton, his daughter, and Miss Carleton were the only members of their party to venture forth to the dining saloon, the others preferring to have a light repast served in their own apartments. The captain, having discovered in Mr. Thornton an old-time friend, had ordered seats for him and his party at his own table, and the young ladies, finding their appetites rather an uncertain quantity, had plenty of opportunity for observing their fellow passengers, particularly an Anglomaniac of the most pronounced type, in the person of a callow youth seated opposite them, whose monocle, exaggerated collar, and affected drawl afforded them considerable amusement. "Winifred," said Miss Thornton as they were leaving the dining saloon, "do you see that young Englishman at the farther table?" Her cousin glanced carelessly in the direction indicated, noting the fine athletic figure seated, back towards them, at some distance, attired in heavy English tweed. "Yes, what of him?" "Nothing in particular, only the sight of him is such a relief, you know, after that wretched caricature at our table." "Poor little harmless dudelet," mused Winifred with a smile. "His self-complacency will be short-lived whenever he meets Isabel. She will simply annihilate him with one of those glances of hers." At Miss Carleton's suggestion they went on deck, but Edith grew so rapidly ill that her cousin assisted her below to their own elegant suite of apartments, which adjoined, on one side, those occupied by Mrs. Mainwaring and her daughter, while on the other was the comfortable stateroom belonging to Mrs. Hogarth. Finding Mrs. Mainwaring and Isabel already reduced to a state of abject helplessness, which required the attendance of both maids as well as of the stewardess, Miss Carleton left Edith in Mrs. Hogarth's care, and wrapping herself warmly, again went on deck. The wind was increasing, and she found the decks nearly deserted, but the solitude and the storm suited her mood just then, and wrapping her rug closely about her, she seated herself in a comparatively sheltered place, alone with her own thoughts. As she recalled the parting interview with Mr. Whitney, another face seemed to flash before her vision, and a half-formed query, which had been persistently haunting her for the last few hours, now took definite shape and demanded a reply. What would have been the result if that other, instead of leaving without one word of farewell, had asked for the hope of something better and deeper than friendship? What would her answer have been? Even in the friendly shadow of the deepening twilight, she shrank from facing the truth gradually forcing itself upon her. A solitary figure pacing the deck aroused her from her reverie. As he approached, she recognized the young Englishman of whom Edith had spoken. Dressed in a warm jacket, with cap well pulled down over his eyes and hands clasped behind him, he strode the rolling deck with step as firm and free as though walking the streets of his native city. She watched him with admiration, till something in his carriage reminded her of the young secretary at Fair Oaks, and in the sudden thrill of pleasure produced by that reminder, there was revealed to her inner consciousness a confirmation of the truth she sought to evade. She watched the retreating figure with flashing eyes and burning cheeks. "It is not true!" she exclaimed to herself passionately. "I do not care for him. It was only a fancy, a foolish infatuation, of which, thank heaven, neither he nor anyone else shall ever know." But the monarch who had taken possession of her heart, call him by what name she chose, was not so easily dethroned. Meanwhile, the young English stranger passed and repassed, unconscious of the figure in the shadow, unconscious of the aversion with which one of his countrywomen regarded him because of his resemblance to another. He, too, was vainly seeking the solution of problems which baffled him at every turn, and waging an ineffectual warfare against the invisible but potent sovereign, love. All that night the storm raged with increasing fury, and morning found the entire Mainwaring party on the retired list, as Miss Carleton expressed it. She herself was the last to succumb,